Forget the posters tacked above bunkhouse beds and the slow-motion close-ups in Hollywood showdowns. The real Wild West didn't glow under studio lights. It lived in dust, sweat, bad coffee, and guns that worked or got you killed. And out there, the frontier didn't care what was stamped on the base of a cartridge. It cared about what actually dropped a charging horse, a raiding party, or the last deer on a frozen hillside. The story most people know is simple. Big irons on the hip, giant calibers, famous names, Colt 45, 45-70, big bores, big noise, big legend, but that legend leaves a lot of brass on the ground. Because beneath the poster guns and showpiece rifles was a whole shadow ecosystem of strange, forgotten ammunition. Cartridges that looked too small, too old, too odd, rounds gun writers later scoffed at, that shopkeepers sold as varmint loads, or cheap options for folks who couldn't afford anything better. They were wrong. Behind the barroom arguments and campfire boasting, these so-called weaklings were quietly doing the ugly work of frontier survival. Thick-walled brass reloaded until the rims wore thin, rimfires that barked smoke and sparks in cramped hallways, Civil War leftovers pushed into new rifles, oddball calibers born in obscure eastern factories, then hauled west in wagon crates, saddlebags, and pockets until they ended up in lonely cabins and railroad sidings. Some of these cartridges looked harmless in the hand. Short, stumpy, underwhelming. But in the right gun, at the right distance, they hit like sudden disaster. They broke shoulders, they smashed bone, they anchored buffalo, horses, and men with a finality that didn't make it onto movie posters. Then, as newer powders and sleeker bullets took over, they faded. They slipped from store shelves, from catalogs, from memory. A few cases remained at the bottom of rusted tins, in junk drawers in ghost town cellars, and scattered in the dirt around crumbled firing positions on forgotten hills. Today, we're pulling them back into the light. No romantic duels, no spinning revolvers, no echo chamber of Hollywood sound effects. Just 7 forgotten Wild West ammo types that hit far harder than their size, reputation, or history suggests. The cartridges carried by people who didn't care what was fashionable. They cared about what would still be in the chamber when everything else went wrong. So clear your mind like a freshly scrubbed barrel. Let go of the myth that only giants ruled the frontier. Because once you understand what these little and obsolete rounds really did, you won't look at the guns of the Old West the same way again. The next time someone tells you the West was won only by famous big bores, you'll know better. You'll know the quiet exceptions. 32-20 Winchester, the ranch hand's shape-shifting workhorse. If you walked into a hardware store on the frontier and asked for something light, cheap, and useful, odds are a clerk handed you a box of .32-20. Even the name sounded modest. A .32 caliber bullet over 20 grains of black powder. It was marketed as a small game and varmint round. A homesteader's cartridge, a boy's first rifle ammunition. On paper, that's exactly what it looked like. The bullet was relatively light, the charge modest compared to monsters like the 45-70. It was easy on the shoulder and easier on the wallet. In a ledger book or catalog listing, it was the kind of round you'd skim past without a second thought. But the prairie doesn't grate on paper. Out of a rifle-length barrel, the little lead slug picked up serious speed. At close to moderate ranges, it hit with enough energy to tear through coyotes, feral dogs, and even deer-sized game. A rancher sitting up at night with a lantern burning low, listening to the nervous shuffle of livestock just outside the fence line, didn't care what the ballistic tables said. He cared that when a gray shape slunk into the yard, the .32-20 would bark once and the threat would drop. The real magic of the .32-20 was simple. It could be everywhere at once. Winchester and other makers chambered it in handy lever-action carbines. Revolver manufacturers followed suit, turning it into a true companion cartridge. A man could ride with a short rifle in his scabbard and a 6-shot on his hip, both fed from the same dinged-up box of cartridges rattling around in his saddlebag. That meant fewer mistakes in the dark, no fumbling different calibers when hands were shaking, less money spent stocking multiple types of ammunition. In the chaos of ranch life and trail work, that kind of simplicity saved lives. In town, some people scoffed at it as a pop gun. They pictured it knocking over jackrabbits, not men. But newspaper clippings and coroner's notes hinted at another truth. More than a few frontier shootings ended with a .32 caliber wound listed as the final cause. Fights in cramped saloons, arguments in back alleys, family disputes at 10 feet or less, the .32-20 fired from a revolver at close range didn't ask for anyone's respect. It took it. Of course, it had limits. Past 100 yards, the bullet fell fast, arcing down sooner than the bigger, flatter shooting rounds. Wind shoved it around, against heavy bone at distance or against thick cover. It was not the cartridge you'd choose if you had time and options, but the frontier rarely offered either. Families judged ammunition the way they judged tools. Does it work? Can I afford it? Can I fix it? Reload it? Reuse it? The .32-20 answered yes, yes, and yes. Cheap, mild recoiling, easy to reload at a kitchen table with simple tools, it became the quiet backbone of ranch life. By the early 20th century, new smokeless cartridges and more specialized hunting rounds pushed it aside. But for decades, this small round did outsized work. Underestimate it in the wrong moment, and you might not get a chance to rethink your opinion. And if you think it was the only unassuming cartridge that could end a life at close range, wait until you meet the tiny Thunderbolt gamblers pinned their last hopes on. 41 rimfire Derringer, silk, lace, and sudden death. If the .32-20 was the ranch hand's tool, the .41 rimfire was the gambler's last prayer. This cartridge was never about the open range. It wasn't meant to drop deer at 100 yards or punch through a buffalo shoulder. It was born for cramped stairwells, smoky gambling halls, and narrow boarding house corridors. Anywhere trouble arrived at arm's length. The .41 rimfire lived inside the iconic over-under Remington Derringer, a pistol so small it could disappear into a waistcoat pocket or the hollow of a boot. You could hide it in a lady's garter, a riverboat dealer's sleeve, or the inside pocket of a dusty frock coat. The gun was barely more than a pair of barrels, a trigger, and just enough grip to keep it from jumping out of your hand. On a chart, the cartridge looked pitiful. The bullet was short. The powder charge was modest. Compared to full-size revolver rounds, its velocity was low. Later generations of gun cranks mocked it as inaccurate and anemic, something only a fool would carry for protection. But charts don't measure distance. The .41 rimfire was designed for ranges you could measure in inches, not yards. At that distance, its apparent weaknesses turned into strengths. The bullet was fat for its length, a soft lead slug that behaved more like a slow hammer than a high-speed dart. Fired across a card table, jammed into a belly, or pressed into a coat at grappling range, it smashed into flesh and lodged deep, dumping its energy instead of zipping clean through. Dance hall girls, traveling salesmen, and card sharps learned to trust that ugly little cartridge. They carried Derringers hidden in corsets, garters, and tailored vests. They knew that if a smile turned sour and a hand went for a knife or a heavy bottle, their best chance wasn't a showy belt gun they couldn't conceal. It was the small, unimpressive pistol no one realized they had until it was already pointed at a rib cage. Stories from the time tell of men laughing off the little .41, right up until they saw the twin muzzles staring at them from across a narrow stair landing. At that range, the cartridge didn't need to be accurate in any refined sense. It just needed to be close. The .41 rimfire had serious flaws. Rimfire priming in those days could be unreliable, especially as cartridges aged or were poorly stored. Accuracy beyond a few paces was miserable. The Derringer held only 2 rounds, and reloading under stress was a fantasy more than a plan. But again, the Graves didn't care about the cartridge's reputation. As revolver design improved and smokeless powder rewrote expectations, the .41 rimfire slipped into the background. Newer, stronger, small cartridges took its place. Yet for decades, this stubby little round proved a hard truth of the Old West. At belly gun distance, intent and surprise matter more than muzzle energy. Gamblers and showgirls chose concealment over caliber. Lawmen and soldiers turned to something else entirely, turning heavy war cartridges into blunt instruments of frontier justice. 56 to 50 Spencer, the Civil War's repeater that kept on talking. Long before the Winchester 1873 became the gun that won the West in dime novels, another lever gun was rewriting the rules of firepower. The Spencer, its cartridge, the .5650 rimfire, was born in the smoke and mud of the American Civil War. At first glance, it looked primitive. A short, fat case topped with a heavy bullet, designed more for reliability and impact than elegance. It carried the look of a round built by men who expected to be shooting in the rain, crawling through the dirt, or firing from the back of a galloping horse. The Spencer rifle and carbine fed 7 of those stubby cartridges from a tubular magazine in the buttstock. In a world still dominated by single-shot muzzleloaders, that was nothing short of revolutionary. While one soldier fumbled with powder, ball, and percussion cap, a man with a Spencer could lever and fire, lever and fire, again and again until all 7 rounds were gone. When the war ended, thousands of surplus Spencers and crates of .56 to .50 ammo followed veterans west. They ended up in the hands of settlers, scouts, and militia units. On the frontier, nobody cared that the cartridge had been designed for blue jacket infantry. What mattered was this: at typical engagement distances, the .5650 hit like a sledgehammer. The bullet, around half an inch across, carried enough weight to crush through flesh, bone, and even light timber at close range. Accounts from the Indian Wars describe ponies collapsing mid-stride, riders flung from saddles, and warriors breaking off attacks after feeling the punishing volume of fire a small unit of Spencer-armed troopers could throw. On the civilian side, the rifle's magazine and the cartridge's raw thump made it a serious defender of wagon trains and isolated homesteads. A farmer with a Spencer over the door didn't necessarily have the newest or prettiest rifle, but he had 7 quick shots of very strong persuasion ready to go. The .56 to 50's weaknesses were built into its bones. Being a large rimfire round, it was relatively difficult and expensive to manufacture. As years passed and supplies dwindled, resupplying could become an adventure of its own. As new centerfire cartridges like the 4440 and 4570 hit the market, with better range, easier reloading, and stronger guns built around them, the old fat Spencer round began to look outdated. Rifles were converted to fire other cartridges or retired completely. Ammunition dried up, and the 5650 slipped into obscurity. But in the window between the smoke of the Civil War and the gleam of the Winchester era, this clumsy-looking round was the frontier's blunt instrument. It didn't care about long-range precision. It cared about ending a charge, breaking a line, or convincing a group of attackers that they had picked the wrong target. If that feels heavy, the next cartridge took overbuilt and pushed it straight into buffalo country. 50 to 70 government, the Army's sledgehammer on the plains. Before the now famous 4570 became the darling of hunters and historians, an older brute was already breaking shoulders and shattering expectations: the 5070 government. Born in the late 1860s, this was the United States Army's first serious attempt at a modern metallic cartridge service round. Old muzzle-loading muskets were cut and converted into breech-loading trapdoor rifles. To feed them, the Army chose a simple but brutal formula: a half-inch wide lead bullet over 70 grains of black powder. On paper, the numbers are impressive. In the field, they were downright frightening. Out of a full-length rifle barrel, the big bullet thundered forward with enormous momentum. Soldiers fired it in early Indian Wars campaigns, feeling it slam back into their shoulders and watching it throw up fountains of dust and splinters downrange. The recoil was savage. Complaints filtered back through the ranks about sore shoulders and flinching recruits. Civilians who got their hands on surplus trapdoor Springfields and their ammunition shrugged at the recoil and shouldered it anyway, because the results on the receiving end were too good to ignore. On the open prairie, where distances could stretch and the wind never stopped moving, the 50-70 supplied something invaluable: reach combined with authority. A practiced rifleman who understood his rifle's trajectory could use it to flatten large animals at ranges that made smaller calibers feel anemic. For buffalo hunters operating before the true age of specialized Sharps behemoths, the 50-70 offered a bridge between wartime surplus and commercial slaughter. Physical evidence from old kill sites and dug bullets tells a blunt story. Recovered .50 caliber slugs show deep deformation, smashed ribs, and shattered vertebrae. These were not graceful killers. They were blunt instruments of massive trauma. If one of those bullets arrived where it was meant to, there was no argument over whether it hit hard enough. When the Army adopted the 45-70 in 1873, the writing was on the wall for the big half-inch round. The new cartridge shot flatter, fouled a little less, and worked better with evolving ideas about long-range marksmanship. Army logistics shifted, and the 50-70 slowly lost its official backing. But cartridges don't vanish overnight. For years, 50-70 rifles and ammunition lingered in private hands. Hunters kept them in use as long as ammunition could be bought or hand-loaded. Ranchers and settlers left them hanging over doors or propped in corners, the big gun for when things got truly dire. Eventually, though, progress rolled past it. Ammunition houses scaled back production. New rifles were chambered in newer, more efficient rounds. The 50-70 became a curiosity, then a collector's item, then a piece of trivia for historians. Out on the 19th century plains, though, no one asked whether it was famous. They just called it the big one. And when it spoke, things tended to stay down. And while this was a converted soldier's round pressed into civilian service, another cartridge was built from the ground up for a specific, brutal job: turning living mountains of buffalo into meat and hides at staggering distances. 44-77 Sharps, the buffalo hunter's precision hammer. Say Sharps rifle today, and most people picture enormous bores, titanic recoil, and buffalo dropping in slow motion on some film set. But before the truly colossal calibers arrived, one round had already turned long-range buffalo hunting into a science: the 44-77. Introduced in the late 1860s, the 44-77 was one of the earliest American bottleneck rifle cartridges. It was designed not as a military standard or a general-purpose farm round, but as a tool for serious riflemen and professional hunters who needed a balance of range, power, and practicality. Loaded into heavy Sharps rifles, often weighing 12 pounds or more, the 44-77 offered something rare for its time: a relatively flat trajectory combined with a bullet heavy enough to anchor huge animals. Buffalo runners learned to read the wind, judge distance across waves of grass, and dial their sights or hold over in just the right way so that the slow, heavy slug would arc down into a vital zone hundreds of yards away. On paper, there were bigger calibers. On the ground, few rounds were as consistently deadly at the distances that mattered most. Buffalo Bill Cody, in his early years as a hunter, providing meat for railroad workers and army posts, made extensive use of 44 caliber Sharps rifles. He didn't need legend. He needed rifles and cartridges that would put animals down cleanly, efficiently, and repeatedly. The 44-77 delivered, but it wasn't without problems. Black powder fouling built up quickly in the bore during long shooting sessions. Hunters would pause to run a patch through their rifle, knowing that the sticky residue could throw shots wide if ignored. As the 1870s rolled on, Newer and bigger Sharps calibers appeared, offering even more reach and power. 45-90, 50-90, and other giants built for the last bloody years of the buffalo trade. At the same time, the herds themselves were vanishing. The combination of relentless hunting, railroads, and government policy drove bison numbers down to a fraction of their former millions. By the time the biggest calibers really came into their own, the age of large-scale commercial hunting was already dying. The 44-77 faded alongside it. By the turn of the century, it was overshadowed, almost forgotten outside of a few aging hunters and competitive marksmen who remembered what it could do. Yet in that critical window, when skilled shooters and mass slaughter intersected, this mid-sized cartridge was one of the most important rounds on the plains. If the .50-70 was a blunt hammer, the .44-77 was a scalpel with weight behind it. And while it proved how deadly careful marksmanship could be, another, far stranger cartridge tried to win the West through sheer volume. 44 Evans, the 28-shot experiment. Most frontier rifles followed a simple rhythm. Fire a handful of shots, stop, reload under pressure, repeat. The Evans rifle threw that rhythm out the window. Invented by a Maine dentist named Warren Evans, the rifle used a helical magazine built into the buttstock, a spiral channel that fed cartridges forward as the lever was worked. To make this bizarre system function, he created a unique cartridge, the 44 Evans. Short, bottle-shaped, and tailored specifically to ride that twisting path, the .44 Evans was not simply another .44 in a world of .44s. It was the key that made a very unusual lock work. Depending on the model, an Evans rifle could hold up to 28 of those cartridges. For a settler facing the possibility of a raid, or a scout riding alone in uncertain country, the idea of having that many rounds on tap without reloading was intoxicating. The cartridge itself sat in the same general power range as other medium-bore rifle rounds of the era. Out of the Evans's barrel, it carried enough speed and weight to put down deer, wolves, or a determined attacker at typical engagement distances. It wasn't a buffalo gun, but it didn't pretend to be. Its promise lay in quantity, layered over respectable quality. Picture a group of riders cresting a rise and seeing a lone figure behind a fallen log, working the lever of a rifle that never seems to run dry. Dust jumps all along their line as bullet after bullet snaps past or finds a mark. In a world where most men expected a pause after half a dozen shots, that kind of sustained fire was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. But cleverness can be fragile. The helical magazine, so impressive on a quiet firing line, was less charming when grit and dust worked their way into its guts. The unique cartridge was hard to find outside of certain dealers. In towns where Winchester crates and more standard calibers flowed through the freight office like water, the 44 Evans was a trickle. A frontier rifle has to do more than fire. It has to be fed. In the end, the Evans Company could not compete with the simpler, more robust designs of its rivals. Winchester, with its strong marketing and expanding distribution network, filled racks and saddle scabbards with lever guns that used more common cartridges. The Evans rifle, and the .44 Evans round with it, faded into the margins of firearms history. Yet for a brief moment, they offered a glimpse of a different frontier, not ruled by a few big bores and single shots, but by a continuous storm of medium-bore fire. And that brings us to the last of our forgotten 7, a cartridge so ordinary-looking that most people never realize it quietly built the legend of the cowboy rifle. 44 Henry rimfire, the little round that made repeaters terrifying. If one cartridge deserves more credit than almost any other for changing how the West was fought and settled, it is the unassuming 44 Henry rimfire. It was introduced around 1860 for a rifle that bore the same name, the Henry, Unlike the single-shot muskets and cap-and-ball rifles of the era, the Henry rifled a new path forward, a brass-framed lever action with a magazine running under the barrel. 16 rounds of .44 rimfire sat ready in that tube, waiting to be fed into the chamber with a simple flick of the hand. On paper, the cartridge was not remarkable. A moderate-sized bullet over a modest black powder charge, producing what would later be considered middling muzzle energy. By the standards of the heavy buffalo guns that followed, it looked almost tame. But again, charts lie by omission. Before the Henry, most men on the frontier lived inside a terrifying rhythm. Shoot once, then reload, while hoping no one charged, flanked, or simply shot faster. Cap and ball revolvers eased that somewhat, but even they required slow, careful loading and were prone to fouling and misfires. The .44 Henry, in its namesake rifle, broke that rhythm. 16 shots without reloading, 16 cracks in rapid succession from one shooter, pouring out of a brass-framed repeater. On battlefields where the rifles saw limited use during the Civil War, opponents reportedly cursed them as diabolical. On the frontier, the effect was the same. Suddenly, one defender behind a wagon or cabin wall could match or beat the sustained fire of several men with single-shot guns. Within 100 to 200 yards, the .44 Henry had more than enough punch to put down unarmored men, horses, and medium game. No, it wouldn't reliably break the shoulder of a buffalo at long range. It wasn't meant to. It was built to keep attackers at bay, to rescue a stagecoach from an ambush, to give a small group of defenders a chance when they were badly outnumbered. Its limitations were real. As a rimfire in a relatively long brass case, ignition could be temperamental if the ammunition was poorly made or handled rough. The modest powder charge meant the bullet lost steam sooner than later, smokeless centerfire designs. As the decades rolled on, cartridges like the .44-40, running in improved rifles, offered flatter trajectories and better performance across the board. The .44 Henry began to look like yesterday's breakthrough, but by then its work was already done. Without it, the lever action might have remained a clever curiosity. With it, the idea of a repeating rifle proved itself in mud, smoke, and blood. Cowboys, guards, scouts, and settlers learned firsthand that a magazine full of little .44 rimfires could change the outcome of an ambush or a desperate last stand. On paper, you could dismiss it as underpowered. On dusty hillsides and lonely trails where men fought for their lives, 16 quick shots of anything .44 caliber that hit flesh were enough to change a mind or end one. The frontier was built on good enough that turned out deadly. 7 cartridges, some small, some heavy, some born in war, some in obscure workshops, some carried in silk and lace, others slung in rough leather over a saddle horn. The .3220 that ranch hands bought for small game, but trusted when something bigger and meaner came prowling around the chicken coop. The .41 rimfire that gamblers hid in places no one would think to search, dismissed on charts but unforgiving at 2 feet. The Civil War-born .5650, Spencer that carried repeating fire and heavy bullets into the uncertain years after Appomattox. The bruising .50 to .70 government that blurred the line between war cartridge and buffalo gun. The precise .44 to .77 sharps that let professional hunters reach across seas of grass and drop giants. The ambitious .44 Evans that tried to win through capacity instead of caliber. And the humble .44 Henry rimfire that proved 16 little rounds in a reliable rifle could change the shape of a fight and the reputation of the repeating gun forever. The Wild West was not won by one perfect cartridge. It was shaped by men and women making hard choices with whatever ammunition they could afford, carry, and trust. In cramped alleys, at lonely cabin doors on high prairie ridges and railroad cuts. Cartridges that looked weak or outdated on paper turned out to be more than enough when the trigger broke. Before you click away, take a second to picture yourself there for real. It's late autumn in 1880. The wind is sneaking through the gaps in the boards, and you're standing in a dim general store that smells like kerosene, flour, and cold iron. On the counter is a short stack of ammunition boxes. You can't buy everything. Your rifle back at the cabin is old. Your revolver is secondhand. And what you choose has to feed both as well as protect the people waiting for you at home. Do you grab the big bruiser rounds that kick like a mule and empty your wallet, or the little cartridges that you know you can shoot straight, reload on long winter nights, and carry by the handful in your pockets? Out there, that wasn't a thought experiment. It was the kind of choice that decided who came back from the line shack, the cattle drive, or the stage run. That's the world these forgotten ammo types belonged to. A world where good enough on the box often turned out to be far more than enough when steel met bone, and decisions were measured in fractions of a second. If you're still here, you're clearly not just chasing movie myths. You care about the real mechanics of how the West was armed and survived. So do the algorithm a favor and hit like so. This kind of deep dive into forgotten frontier ammunition doesn't get buried under slow-motion six-gun montages. Drop a comment with the cartridge you trust if you had to ride into the unknown with only one rifle or revolver on your side. And if you want more true frontier history, the weapons, the tactics, and the quietly deadly gear that mattered when everything was on the line, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the legend of the Wild West wasn't built only by the loudest calibers or the flashiest guns. It was built by the cartridges that quietly did their job, hit harder than anyone expected, and then sank back into the dust, leaving only spent brass and stories behind.